Welcome to our final 2019 roundtable. It's been a great season and we're looking forward to next year already, but for today we have a really special program that we'll get around to announcing in just a second here. First, a few housekeeping announcements. MCAT is here. They have 2 cameras here, so those of you in the audience, you're going to be on camera this time, so you have to stay awake the whole program. I want to thank them so much for coming, and Friends of Two Rivers who applied for the grant, for them to be here and preserve these really important historic programs that we've been putting on. And I want to thank them and all of you for making the effort to make sure that Bonner history lives on. I also want to thank St. Anne Church. We haven't been here until today. This year it's kind of fun, like a homecoming. They're always such gracious hosts. We have cookies and coffee and tea in the back, so please help yourself at any time during the program that you feel like you want a snack. The restrooms are on the south end or west, whichever, behind the partition to go around the table and back along the hallway there. And a special event that we have in March every year for the past several years is the Better Than Butte Pasty Supper. So if you don't think they are, you're going to have to eat 1 or 2 to make sure that you're evaluating it properly. It's a great bargain. If you need to leave, you can take with for $5 per pasty. If you're going to stay here for supper, $7 will get you a pasty with gravy and coleslaw, all homemade and delicious. So hope you can stay. Next, I would like to introduce Kim Briggeman, who really doesn't need an introduction, but I will tell you that he's going to talk a little bit about the explanation of the history, the religious history panels that you see around the room, and he also is going to tell you of the available of some St. Anne history books that he brought. So, Kim?
Thank you, Judy Matson. Yeah, this has apropos to nothing to do with the BFPA, but we are here for history and we are in a church. In 2017, a year and a half ago, St. Francis Xavier Catholic Church in Missoula celebrated their 125th anniversary, I guess you'd call it. And in conjunction with that, Patrice Schwenk, who is the librarian at Loyola, among other things, she put together panels apropos to everything St. Francis into St. Francis history. So as you look around, you'll see St. Patrick Hospital, the various parishes around the area. Father Palladino is over there, Ravalli. No De Smet. I guess De Smet was gone by the time St. Francis came around. So that's the explanation here. We get them on loan for an undetermined amount of time, but fortunately it's through Lent at least.
Jim, I want to know whether the pasties are green.
They're pasties. They don't have to be green. It's just Irish all over them. I'd like to... Gordon?
An Irishman from Butte helped make them.
An Irishman from Butte helped make them, that's right. Actually, several of them, including Father Mike Poole, who started this tradition when he was out here, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years ago, somewhere like that. So, with that, I'll get out of here. I'm going to introduce Andy, but Andy's going to kind of introduce himself and talk about Fire on the Mountain, the history of the BFPA.
Thanks, Kim. It's nice to see so much green. I brought some green along here too, so hopefully everyone here will get something out of this presentation. The history of the BFPA is, for over 50 years, was a history of the Bonner, Milltown, West Riverside community. And I think it's been a very integral part of our lives from 1921. I don't know, is there anybody here that's older than that was born before 1921? Till 1971, the BFPA was active in this community as a private land fire protection organization. It is supposed to give a little background on myself, and I wasn't born in Bonner, Milltown. I was born in the Midwest. Didn't come out west till 1961 to work for the Forest Service in northern Idaho. I was a fire control person, fell in love with the West, and was fortunate enough after going to college and getting a degree or two there to go ahead and be able to stay and put down roots. My wife, I met my wife, that changed my career path, and became part of the Bonner community. The BFPA is one of 3 fire protection associations that came to Montana. They were homegrown. It was based on a need to protect lands, property, and timber on private lands that fell outside the jurisdiction of the various government agencies, state agencies, and what have you. The BFPA was the second, not the first, fire protection agency in Montana that protected private lands. Principally, all 3 associations were directed at forest lands as the primary. The people that started the BFPA, and I've got a chart here with some of the key players that started it, were associated with the companies or had large interest in forest lands. And because of their interest in growing trees as a product to make economic sense, they wanted to protect them. And they fell outside the jurisdiction of various government agencies here. And I'm going to give some history of what went on in Montana. But what you see in the orange, which I know you can't see very well, is the BFPA's area of fire protection that they initiated in 1921. And the blue is the Northern Montana Forest Protection Association. They initiated it in 1911. The third fire protection district was the Anaconda Forest Fire Protection District, and that was in 1956. So these 3 associations kind of filled the gap between the various land ownerships, the Flathead Indian Reservation, Forest Service lands, BLM lands, and various other forest ownerships or development ownerships. I know it's hard to see there, but Missoula is right here. Basically, it runs from just a little west of St. Regis all the way to close to McDonald Pass. The association kind of fit in to cover the gaps between the forest boundaries. And as such, it kind of, you can see down here, this is the Bitterroot Valley, this is the Sapphires on the east side of the Bitterroot Valley. That was part of the BFPA. Over to Deer Lodge, Drummond area right here. Here's just bumping up against the forest boundaries, up against what became the Bob Marshall Wilderness area, Ebro Hill, the Flathead Indian Reservation, and then along the reservation boundary. It was created at a time that brought out the need to protect forest lands. And I'll go a little bit through the history of it, and when you get a chance, come up, take a look at it. There's some A lot of small things you can't see here on that protection area. To give the background, go all the way back to 1803. The Lewis and Clark expedition, Louisiana Purchase, and what have you. The lands were purchased from France, or I should say the U.S. purchased the claim that France made to the lands. So the United States government under Jefferson assumed that responsibility and acquired lands which were paid for at the rate of, I think, about 3 cents an acre at that point in time. So that was kind of the beginning. That was a monetary transaction. Before then, it was kind of free reign for anybody that was on the land. As we are in St. Anne's, the St. Mary's Mission was established by Father Ravalli, and that was in 1845. What became Missoula Mills, that occurred in 1860. Montana Territory, 1864, only had a population at that time of about 16,000 people in the state of Montana. The first settlements in the Bitterroot Valley outside of the St. Mary's Mission occurred in 1870, and then we got into the legislation portion, the Timber and Stone Act, which allowed people to go on the land and purchase up to 160 acres for $2.50 per acre. Okay, so land that was owned by the government was sequentially converted to private lands over with the Timber and Stone Act. So Missoula was incorporated as a city in 1883, and some of the earliest laws that were passed by the territory involved fire protection. In 1889, we became a state. We were admitted as the state of Montana in the Union. The state legislature in 1895 enacted basic fire laws, very similar to the codes that had previously been adopted. The federal government in 1905 became very, very active in the administration of federal forest reserves. Gifford Pinchot, the establishment of the National Forest, and what have you, was in full force and also involved with surveying lands that were out here in the Montana territory or state. Of the key things that happened in 1907, the state established an office of state fire warden. This is kind of significant in that it was 2 years later that they finally got around to establishing the office of state forester. A lot of things started happening and during that period. It was kind of a critical period of development. The most significant thing was, and I think just about everybody in this room is familiar with, is the 1910 fire. That fire was a major turning point in what happened in Montana regarding fire prevention and protection. 3 million acres in Montana and Idaho were burned. 83 plus people were killed by the fire. The timber at that point in time was just in the process of getting a lot of value. People recognized the value of it, but in order to have value, you have to be able to convert timber into useful products. The history of Montana, mining generated a big demand for timber. Timber was important to everybody's daily life. If you needed to bring firewood in every night to keep warm, you know, it was pretty important stuff. And to build houses and do things, timber became very, very critical. The railroads came out west here, passed through Missoula, created an opportunity to tap wider markets. What happened in Butte in terms of the copper mining and such was a real boom. People realized that timber had an economic value, not only an aesthetic value, but it was something that could be used and reused and was critical to a person's life. I know they've got over 10,000 uses of a tree. These, you know, in terms of the Forest Products Lab. So it was kind of a critical thing. As I said, over here, 1911, the Northern Montana Forest Protection Association. What was happening in the West at that point in time was Montana was kind of a place you stopped to get to the West Coast, to Seattle, to Oregon, to California. The people in Washington and Oregon had beautiful timber, some of the best timber in the world, the Douglas fir forests and such, and it had tremendous economic value. And they were the leaders in private forest protective associations. The federal government was just getting its feet on the ground, didn't have the resources, and people that had timber, it was kind of like having a bank account, okay? But timber is a different kind of a bank account. You have to grow it first, or it has to be grown. If you have it, if you have money in the bank, basically, you're fairly certain. But if you have a stand of timber, it is only valuable in the economic use that you can put it to. So here in Montana, people that had timberlands, particularly the Anaconda Company, private individuals, J. Neals, anybody that had acquired timberlands was kind of concerned because their bank account was in jeopardy. You had, if you had a fire, in order to grow that bank account, you had to wait a long period of time. It was valuable. And so that recognition of the value of timber and to be able to put it to economic use needed to be protected. And if you had a ranch and you had timber on your ranch there, that was an asset that you needed to be able to protect. And that was the main reason that we have 3 private or fire protection associations protecting private lands. So the Office of State Forester was created, in, as I said, in 1909. That they took the lead, they cooperated, and there was a really interesting relationship between private industry and the associations. They had a mutual desire to accomplish something, protect timberlands and the value that they had. So I'm going to run through a few of the laws and what have you, but there was a lot of government assistance. The Clark-McNary Act there provided opportunities for government agencies to transfer monies over to the state, to the Office of State Forester and such, to provide assistance to timberland owners. And that form benefited the BFPA in particular because it allowed them to have money to supplement their own private monies. The BFPA initially started at 2 cents an acre that they assessed amongst the timber companies and private forest landowners. If you didn't belong to the BFPA, if you had a fire on your property, you know, you were just out of luck, basically. You had to bear the full cost of trying to put the fire out, whether it be on your timberlands or if your barn or whatever, and such. So it was a mutual aid kind of society or organization. If you were part of it, you got the benefit of the fire protection. And it was very, very a fair type situation and pretty well accepted by farmers, ranchers, and timberland owners. Got so much material here, unfortunately, that it's hard to skip over any of it, but like to go ahead and, if you have a more detailed interest in the fire history of Montana and the BFPA in particular, this book by Gary Moon, The History of Montana State Forestry, does a really good job of laying out a timeline as to what was happening and in terms of fire protection and the development of fire protection agencies. The BFPA met a need. It was a need that was recognized all over the western United States. The real kind of organization that of timber growers on the West Coast created an organization called Western Forestry, and that extended into the Inland Empire here. And they were the major players in developing these various associations. Similar ones in Idaho developed and such, and they were the ones that was trying to do the job of protecting forest lands, and so they played a very valuable role in what we have today. But like all things, all good things, they usually come to an end, and the fire protection associations, because they had a problem that was specific to them, and that problem was you couldn't get reasonably priced insurance on timberland because it was such a long time span and what have you. And also the nation had moved on in terms of laws, liabilities. You know, we have almost more lawyers in the state here than we have trees these days. And liability became a real major concern for these private forest protection associations. So it was kind of a challenge to buck the tide of staying in business as a private association. So ultimately, all three associations chose to go ahead and turn their responsibilities over to the state, and in Montana it was to the Office of State Forester, or you know, subsequently Department of Natural Resources. So that's, in a kind of a broad nutshell, that's the rough history of the BFPA in Montana. And Judy and other members of the Bonner History Group have provided a whole variety of pictures and some things that you get a chance when you're having a coffee break here to take a look at. They're interesting things, and we want to hope and that when we get the chance to have the open mic here and such, we want to gather as much information we can as your interactions with the BFPA, your memories and such, and also anything about that organization. We all have, I think, short stories to share. As I said, I didn't work for the BFPA, but I did work for 7 years with State Forestry in the early 70s, and we did fight fire with several BFPA personnel. So I'd like to go ahead and just flip a few charts here. The pictures that, we have, I think most of you are familiar with River City restaurant there, a tremendous addition to the community here. That restaurant was previously the Western Lumber Company there, and headquarters, and early on in 1943, it became the headquarters for the BFPA. Prior to that, it had been in the old school building in Bonner, which was torn down shortly after 1943, I understand. So this became the headquarters for the BFPA, and this is from kind of memory of what it was when I worked out of that building. They had 3 buildings that were from the CCCs. They were brought from Lolo Creek up Graves Creek as CCC camp, and also a vehicle shed. 2 were used for storage. 1 was a shop to maintain BFPA's equipment. The BFPA was a very efficient, manpower-wise, can-do type operation. They were fortunate in their history to have fire wardens that were very good at fire control activities. Foresters, by their training, use fire as a tool, but then they also rise to the occasion to protect forest stands, because once a fire goes through a stand of timber, you have 2 choices. You can walk away from it, basically, or you can try to salvage what you can. And the BFPA was noted for a very active, aggressive fire program, mainly due to the fire wardens that were in charge of active suppression. The River City Grill here and the old air station here for filling your tires are the only 2 buildings still in existence here. So to orient you, if you're not familiar with it, the town pump building is located right here. It used to be the office or the headquarters for Champion Timberland's operations there for a period of time. So to kind of conclude a little bit here, and we can talk about other things, fire lookouts and some of the patrol activities here during the open mic discussion portion of it. But the BFPA, just to give you an idea, I mentioned the fire wardens. The people that started the organization are people that were really shakers and movers in the Missoula, western Montana community here. W.C. Lubrecht and Ken Ross were major managers for the Anaconda Company there. Lubrecht, was very generous in terms of providing the mechanism to give the School of Forestry the Lubrecht Forest, 30,000 plus acres. And people that were on the board and standing committees and what have you were all related or had some financial interest in making sure timber was protected. The first fire warden was a professor at the forestry school, T.C. Spaulding. He later became a dean at the school here. He must have been quite an individual from what the little reading I've done about him. He was a real good fire person. He was followed by Les Talbot, who passed away here in the late 80s, and he was another really remarkable individual from what I've been told. He spent essentially his entire career outside of time he spent in the South Pacific during World War II as the man to go to really go ahead and protect forest lands. While he was away, this Jack Black filled in, and him, and then Ralph Hansen, who was a resident of the Pilsville community here. Ralph was the one I had most interactions with, and he dispatched you for fires and pulled you away from what you thought you should be doing, and go out and fight fires. And got the time periods as to when they served on the little flip chart there, but Ralph served from 65 to 71 as an employee of the BFPA, and then stayed on with state forestry, and that's where I got to know him, because he kind of dispatched us and really helped us in a lot of ways. Another long-term employee that spent his entire career with the BFPA is Art Aline. He worked out of Drummond. The BFPA had basically three main operational points. One was in Drummond, Montana, and then up in trying to remember. When you get a little older, things kind of fade on you and such. But anyway, shouldn't forget it, but things happen. Art Aline spent in the Drummond area his entire life protecting forest lands in that area. And he was assisted by Tim Murphy, who also passed away, and he was kind of an assistant fire warden there. And Tim was charged at the time that the BFPA was going down to provide fire protection services as part of the Anaconda Company. Also, there was a small period, Don McKenzie that ran the operation at the headquarters, operation by Seeley Lake, that stood in for a year as a fire warden. But these are the people that on the ground made it work. So with that, maybe we can talk with Kim. Has a little bit. He's going to talk on what.
Question for you, though.
Sure, you bet.
The historic timeline includes the Forest Homestead Act.
That's correct.
And that I have to believe that foresters trying to protect forests and homesteaders would have been at each other's throats because the trees are removed to grow crops, corn or wheat or whatever. But where does that fit into western Montana?
Well, that was more of a thing. That was more of a thing on the East Coast than it was out here.
The Swan Valley, up around Sea Lake and so on, were forests that were opened up for homesteading.
Yeah, most of it was timber-related use on there. It didn't grow wheat very well. It was tough climate to do it. Trees were kind of, the main economic crop there. So I don't know how to really answer it, because it goes both ways. In the lower valley bottoms, where you have agricultural land there, it was pretty easy to portion of the 160 acres for crops, and whatever was not suitable, then it was in timber or grazing.
The grassland valley area that had been almost dedicated for homesteading, and then in the post 1910 or something, people still were coming in from the east looking for a homestead. I don't know the year of the Forest Homestead Act.
Yeah, I've got it here, but right now can't speak to it. So, the Timber and Stone Act was the one that was probably the one that really concentrated on timbered areas, because the people that they wanted a place to call home, but they really wanted the timber because that had the values potentially for staying on the land for 5 years and such to prove up. It was kind of a no-brainer there. If you had the opportunity to get the 160 acres of land that had timber on it, that's what you chose, and it got cut over in one way, shape, or form, and it still had value as cut over land. In fact, in some cases, it may improve the value if it was close to an area that was being developed. So, yeah.
Is this open mic now?
Well, we're going to try to get the mic to Kim. That's what we were trying to do here.
I'm going to suggest a deviation from our plan here. I'd like to hear some stories now. I'm going to circle back. My job is to talk about something I don't know much about, but the BFPA after it was transferred over to its responsibilities were transferred over to the state in 1971. They maintained a board. They had lots of money left over, and so I was going to talk about that. But I think there's a lot of stories to be told before that about when it was in operation. And so if we could do the open mic now, and Andy, if you could come up and return to the podium here.
So as we've been doing the last few meetings, we're going to pass this mic around. You're welcome to stand up or come up in front, but you don't need to. You can stay at your seat if you wish. Remember the ice cream cone idea, where you need to hold it close to your mouth so that it picks up the sound of your voice. And this is really important for our historic preservation, because these stories that we're telling today are probably what people are going to have in the future to know about BFPA. So thanks to all of you in advance for. So what I'm going to do is start here with Kenny. If he has something to say, he'll say it. He'll pass it on around, and we'll just go around the room. And then if you think of something that you should have said after we get around, raise your hand, and nobody's going to get cut off. But this will just keep the mic moving in case somebody wants to say something or someone doesn't. So, Kenny.
Thank you. I worked at Bonner for almost 25 years, and I graduated high school in '52 and went to work there, and I had 3 encounters with the BFPA, and the first one was in the summer of '52, because Bonner was the manpower for the BFPA, basically. And so if they had a fire, they would gather up guys from the mill. And I happened to be lucky enough to be one of them. And the first trip we had, they put us in a truck and took us up to McNamara Landing, and then put us on a scooter car with a trailer on it, and took us up to a fire that was close to Belmont. And quite fortunately, we got up there, and it was just a stump that was burning. So it was just a nice scenic trip for us, because a lot of us had never seen that part of the Blackfoot, because it had no roads at that time. But the next time was in 1960, after I'd come back from the service and went to work and was married. And the first fire we went on was Elk Creek, and it was a real good burn at that time. But that was probably the best fire protection anybody could ever have, because Bonner and the BFPA, they really fought the fire. The one night that we were there, the winds came up, and the fire was going down a ridge. You could see it reaching out, and it was about a mile long. And they put 2 cats on that night, and one on each side of it. and they ran that fire down before daylight, and it was over with. That was when they really fought fires. They didn't fly over and drop water on them, because that doesn't do much good, as I see it. But then the third encounter was the Gold Creek fire, and that was a big fire, and we were all involved in that, mostly just digging lines and what. And the one story I have to bring back for that was my buddy Bob. He disturbed a nest of yellow jackets, and he was stung 27 times, and so they hauled him out of there on a gurney and took him to Missoula and got him all fixed up. But that's basically everything I had to do with the BFPA. They were a good organization, and it was nice to help them out.
This is Kenny Pierce, and we all know Kenny, but somebody in the future may not remember. And so I forgot to ask you to also please say your name when you get, if you want to speak in the mic. Do you have anything? No. Just go ahead and pass it on down. Bob, you probably got something. It's on, so it's ready to go.
Okay. My name is Bob Lamley, and I work for the Anaconda Company. Started in 1953 in the timberlands, and enjoyed working with such people as Ralph Hansen. He was really an excellent road locator, and we worked in the Thompson River all that time. And so I've worked with most of the timberlands in the Thompson River, which is about a third of the timberlands that's owned by the company in this area. And one thing about Ralph Hansen was that he was really good at locating roads, and he taught me a lot about road location and everything. And when one day they said, Ralph, come to Missoula, and that's when he became a fire warden at the BFPA. So my experience with Ralph Hansen was really good, and I worked with him. Also, I worked with Tim Murphy in Timberlands. So that's about all I want to say.
I'm Lee Legrid. I was probably one of the few left that was on that Gold Creek fire in 1960 at the top of the Jocko Divide up there. And at the time, they wanted to recruit everybody they could get out of Missoula, and there was like 2 busloads of us that went up at the same time. And I was up there 13 days, had a lot of hours in. It was $1.77 an hour. And after the 13 days, out of those 2 busloads they brought up, I think there was about maybe 8 or 9 of us left out of that first bunch that went up. But I just happened to remember that story, and I thought I'd mention it.
Hi, I'm Ron Wakimoto. For over 33 years, I was the fire professor at the University of Montana. So I got to deal with, I didn't come here till 82, joined the faculty in 82, and I worked with the directors. So George Neff, Martin Briggeman, Gary Moon, Ernie Korick, those, Marshall Moy. Yeah. Those were the guys that I dealt with, and Ralph as well, Ralph Hansen, and it always, at these big national meetings, there were always these Canadians running around with Ralph. Yeah. And I finally figured it out that, when you go to school here, you got to make some money to pay for school. Yeah. And the Canadians really liked being here rather than going home, and because it was BFPA, Ralph could hire them. Yeah. That's a big difference when you're trying to go to school. So it really made it just Ralph was beaming when he'd run around with those guys at a big meeting. Yeah.
Yeah. In 1965, when I graduated in forest management, 40% of the class was Canadians. And so it affected a lot of our speech patterns there. And also it had a lot to do with the amount of beer consumption that occurred within the area, because it was it was a real treat for those Canadians to come on down and do it, and that's very strong ties. In fact, I almost went up to work in Canada in '65 because they had a shortage of people that were trained in forestry at that point in time, and they were really anxious to look for people wherever they could find them. So.
I'm Tony Leon. I started working for the Anaconda Company in either 1970 or 71, and I knew Ralph Hansen at that time. I worked in timberlands, and then when I got out of the Army, I came back to work for Champion International. As Andy mentioned, by that time, the state had taken over the fire protection responsibilities for the former BFPA protected lands. As foresters, as Andy said, we started probably lots of fires, but it was for management purposes. It was burning piles, doing broadcast burns to do regeneration. Getting rid of the slash as we were required to do under state law, and then occasionally we help fight fires with the state. And I can't remember, maybe somebody here will know it. At that time, you had the Forest Service that was doing fire protection. You had the state that was doing fire protection. You had the BLM who was doing fire protection. And the Forest Service protected Forest Service lands, the BLM protected BLM lands, and the state protected state and private lands. And so because the land ownership is so jumbled up here in western Montana, you would have fire engines of one color or another going past each other, going to their own fires. And it was not very efficient. And I can't remember exactly when, but I think it was in the 80s, an effort was made by the agencies, the state and federal agencies, to reduce that confusion. And they decided that they would split up the state of Montana to do fire protection. And so you didn't have fire engines crisscrossing each other across the state. And so the BLM took most of eastern Montana for their fire protection and protected state, private, and Forest Service and BLM lands. On the west side, the Forest Service had protection for Forest Service, state, BLM, and private lands. The state also had fire protection responsibilities for Forest Service, state, BLM, and private lands. But it was blocked up, so it was more efficient for all of these forces to move back and forth and do fire protection and do fire suppression work. I worked for the state starting in 1997. One thing I was going to mention is in that period between early 70s and mid to late 80s, it seemed like it was a wetter period. We didn't have lots of big major fires. And in the 90s, it started drying out, and we started having more fires. I went to work for the state in 1997 as the area manager for the Southwest Land Office, and we basically had responsibility for all of the BFPA lands, the former protection lands, up in the Blackfoot, down in the Garnets, and out towards St. Regis, and up Lolo, so we changed operations a lot from the days of the BFPA to today in how we fight fire and the training that goes into the firefighters, the safety equipment that firefighters are required to have, the type of equipment that we have available for firefighting. And so a lot has changed in the years since 1971, when the BFPA turned over responsibility to the state. So it was an interesting time period.
Joe Gorsh from Butte, America, and I'm not Irish.
I'm sorry.
I did work for the Anaconda Company, but that was down on the 42 and the 4,400 foot levels of the Anselmo mine. However, I used your timber for posts, caps, girts, and lagging. But anyway, those were good old days. However, in 1956, 56, I met Gary Moon when his office was in the corner of the forestry school on campus. Mm-hmm. For some reason, Gary picked on me. And what a great guy. He called me down the office, closed the door, and told me what I should be doing. He suggested I switch into the 5-year curriculum. Before I got out of the 5-year curriculum, he hired me. He said he would, I should say, to go to work for the state of Montana. When I went to work for him, he not only invited me to his both homes for dinner, but that wasn't the reason. I usually was given some guidance, and by God, it was all good. Gary was a great guy. Yeah. And as a result of him, and his pushing, steering me along, and I need a lot of that being from Butte. But he was one heck of a good boss. And I think I owe my career path to Gary. Thank you, Gary.
Jim Habeck. I'm a retired professor of plant ecology with a specialty in fire ecology, and I was a forestry student before many of you were born. 1952, is that right? 52, 53, and the dean of forestry told me that as a senior I would be running around looking at forestry logging camps, learning how to make contracts, get bids, and so on like that. I said, won't I be getting any more forest ecology? You've had all you need. This was Ross Williams, Dean Ross Williams. And some of you, so anyway, I switched from on the campus, UM, in 1952-53 to be a botany major. Botany major. And the Smoky Joe Kramer was the plant ecologist. But he was trained in Nebraska. And what kind of a piece of equipment did I inherit when I finally took it over his job? What was his principal field piece of equipment? Shovel. Bunches of shovel. Why? If you get your training from Nebraska, everything that is ecologically of importance happens where? Under the ground where you can't see. So on field trips, he took his students out and dug holes to see where the roots extended, different plants. Two plants side by side could be different root depths and so on. Anyway, I came back in 1960 and was on the committee for both wildlife and was on a member of graduate committees. And anyway, I got interested in forestry in the sense of fire. And I got many research grants for Glacier Park, to Selway Wilderness, and elsewhere, working on the natural role of fire. That's where we are now nowadays. If you go up Gold Creek, one homestead had their old growth ponderosa pine left. What's the name of that place? And you can still see the remnants and relics of the homestead itself, and it's one of the best pieces of landscape that's left in the Blackfoot drainage. And then we learned about river pigs. I won't go into that.
My name is Jerry Buckhouse, and I lived in Milltown. Okay, is that better? Yeah. We moved to Milltown. I was born in Missoula, and we moved to Milltown in the early 40s, and went through grade school at Bonner and high school at Hellgate. It was called Hellgate then, but it was Missoula County High School then. But anyway, I worked at the mill, and I had my name in at the BFPA to volunteer for fires, and I got a call in the early 60s, probably the same fire that this other fellow talked about up Gold Creek. And we were told that that fire didn't have a road to it, so we had to walk in, and it was at night, and we had to carry all of our equipment. We had Pulaskis and chainsaws and shovels and what have you. And we probably hiked for over 4 hours and ended up on top of a ridge. We could smell the smoke, and the head guy told us, well, we'll wait here till daylight, get a couple hours sleep, and then go down to the fire. Well, we got over the ridge, and we heard a vehicle down below. Evidently, you could drive to the fire. We worked on that fire for one day, and we were told that there was a bunch of Indians that came on the fire. Part of the fire was on the reservation. So they sent us home. And the next day we got a call, said that the fire blew up. I don't know if the Indians had anything to do with that, but I was put on a water truck. And we took the water truck to RLE and had a flat tire. I had to get that tire fixed. But I was in charge of that water truck for the rest of the fire. And I don't remember how long we were there. It was over a week. And the guy, during the fire, they punched a hole from there clear back to the head end of Gold Creek, so we could drive out that way to get back home. And they said, anybody that wants to ride home, get on the water truck. And I bet we had 50 guys on that water truck. But I'll tell you, it was the slowest ride home that they ever had. So that was my experience on the fire.
Well, I guess I better follow Jerry. He usually follows me. Hi, everyone. I'm Mary Ann Buckhouse, and I kind of consider myself an old forester because I started with the Anaconda Company August 1, 1956, and I worked for them for 37 years. With my foresters, and I see several of my wonderful guys around here today. Of course, Bob and Tony. I think I even remember Joe and Craig. So it's always good to see these wonderful people. I just have so many special memories of them, and I feel it was 37 years well spent. I started when I was 18. Now I'm 81, so. And I retired in in 1993. But back to the BFPA, but I want to mention, somebody also mentioned these fellows. George Neff was my first boss, and I was 18. I was his secretary. And then I also worked for Ernie Cork for many years. And he was actually the vice president of the Western Timberlands when we merged with California and Oregon and Washington and Montana. And then, of course, after Ernie retired, I worked with Blaine Bloomgren, whom some of you may know. So I was very, very fortunate to have wonderful bosses and wonderful co-workers. And about Ralph Hansen, I know Ralph, and I remember Les Tarbett. I think it's Tarbett instead of Talbot.
Tarbett.
Tarbett. And Art, I vaguely remember him, and Tim Murphy. Tim Murphy was a very handsome forester. I do remember that. And, of course, he has passed on, as well as George and Ernie. Blaine is still kicking around pretty good. Maybe he's here today, I don't know. But I wanted to mention Ralph Hansen did build, when he retired, he built his home right across the street from Jerry and I in the Bonner Pines addition. Mm-hmm. And then I think Ralph passed then, and his son Bob, of course, inherited the property, and then Bob and his wife moved into that house, and so I was neighbors to Ralph and then his son Bob. And I just have to mention one more thing. I worked for many, many years and spent some time in the BFPA office, but we had a couple secretaries that worked with the foresters in that office. I still remember the combination to the vault. And then the other thing, of course, then we had a fire in our brand new office. We built a brand new office when Ernie became vice president of the Timberlands, etc. And we built a brand new, beautiful office. And of course, that was a fire that was burned down in 1977, 78, something like that. And we rebuilt that office, which was a lovely office. I think there were 43 of us in there when we first started, when we all moved into that office. But anyway, many, many memories, and I do remember my last day in that office, which is now the Exxon station down there. I was the last one to leave that office when Stimson purchased, the Timberlands. I was not retired, so I retired when I was 56, and but it was a sad day when I left that office, because I remember everybody was going different ways, and I was the last one to leave that office. I was the office administrator, and of course I had to do my final duty, walk all around the office and make sure everything was locked up and everything was taken care of. And so then I just walked out the back door and said, "Thank you, Mary Ann, for 37 years of service." And that was the end of it. So that's my story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have to admit, or mention this one thing about Mary Ann. when they built the town pump, they put a casino in there, and Mary Ann refused to go in that office because the casino was right where her office was.
Your hideaway, huh?
Yeah.
I've got a small story about that. Oh, my name is Dana Zimmerman, and I kind of live here. I lied about my age during that electric fire, and I got taken up there by the BFPA and was taken down into a creek bottom on a bulldozer, and I ran a 6-cylinder water-cooled McCulloch pump with no muffler for 30 hours. They fed me 2 sandwiches brought in by a mule train, and I rode back out of there on the bulldozer, and when I went through camp, everyone up there was eating steak. They had quarters of beef hanging around, so I haven't volunteered again since then. So that was my BFPA story.
Andy, you might have to get a referee before I get finished here, because I'll probably be hitting some politics, and because, see, I actually work for 2 different outfits. But anyway, my name's Jim Labby. I was born and raised here in Bonner, Milltown area. I first started with the force. I was up at Seeley Lake in 1957. I was a smoke chaser up there, fought fire, and I was in fire prevention. And anyway, at that time, BFPA had an office in Seeley, and they had one in Ovando. And part of my duties, you know, when I was doing fire prevention and all that, I'd stop in and, you know, BS with those guys, and because I want to know who they were, and they want to know who I was, and, you know, because we intermingled with on fires and so on. And I did the same thing with the guys over at Ovando. You know, I'd get over there occasionally, and I'd stop in, and because I wanted them to know, you know, hey, we are kind of one agency. And I was on several fires with the BFPA people up around Seeley, especially, you know, Placid Lake and around that neck of the woods. And those guys, they knew the country. They knew how to get around. They were good firefighters, and I enjoyed working with them. You know, I was on maybe a dozen fires up there that were actually BFPA fires, but the Forest Service would go in and help out on occasion because, you know, we had interest there too. And so anyway, that's, you know, kind of how I started out knowing the guys in BFPA. While we're talking about fires, you didn't mention the lookouts that the BFPA had.
No, in terms of reference, that some of the stuff I had said 5 lookouts. I could only identify 3, Hunter's Point there, Saddle Mountain, and Union Peak. They used temporary lookouts in the early days of the BFPA. They used lookout trees and tents. They also used mobile equipment, you know. They're patrolled in cars and trucks, and they built scratch roads. They laid miles and miles of phone line. They didn't have iPhones or anything like that to deal with, so they had to have a hardwired line, and that was one of the early problems the BFPA ran into, was just communication. And they used the public and ranchers, kids, farm kids, ranch kids. Anytime a fire, somebody tried to get to a phone or whatever that was available, and but most of the time it was just go to the fire, period. And so that development took quite a period of time, but it also put a lot of responsibility on the people that were out there, either with the BFPA or friends of the BFPA. And on a lot of cases, whose property the fire was on when it was discovered wasn't generally known. And so on fires, I know we happened to me several times by Avon Elliston on being dispatched by the state on a fire. It was close enough to Forest Service lands, and so you get on the fire, you go ahead and knock it down as quick as you could, and then you find out that it's actually on Forest Service fire protection, so you go through the whole process of turning the fire over, and you can get into some trouble, and I did one time there doing the same thing. I refused to turn it over to the Forest Service because they didn't have people that could deal with the fire, and so I just refused to get off the fire because it was a 10-acre fire in a post and pole patch. We had knocked the fire down. We had scratched line all the way around, and Forest Service people came on the fire, and they wanted to take it over, and they thought it was a major fire when it was, you know, it was a later season fire. It wasn't going any place and what have you. So, you know, the boundaries are there, and you just try to do the best you can to make it work. So.
Yeah, and Andy, I think one other lookout you had was Mineral Peak up around Ovando. Not Mineral Peak, but
Montour Hill.
Montour Hill.
Yeah.
Montour Hill. And I think at one time you might have even had Belmont lookout.
Yeah, I couldn't find anything in the stuff I looked at there, but
yeah, I
that's
think
probably a good shot at it.
Yeah. Yeah, Belmont, and then Hunter Point, they're on the Paws Up Ranch and all that.
Yeah. I forgot to mention that we actually appear to have on display there the firefinder from
Hunter's Point.
Hunter's Point there, and it's a really unusual piece. I'd never seen that design because I was mostly familiar with Forest Service lookouts. And so...
The base it's on is called a portable base with Bosworth, and it weighs probably 100 pounds practically, so whoever said it's portable never carried that.
Yeah. Scott, could you introduce yourself there? Steve, excuse me.
Museum, Historical Museum. Oh, okay.
Yeah, you'll get it back.
So my name is Steve Bixby. I'm a volunteer out at the Historical Museum there at Fort Missoula, and it's kind of interesting. I knew absolutely nothing about the BFPA up until probably a month ago when I was talking to Ron, and I don't know how we got on the subject, but he told me a bit about it, and it just kind of clicked that in the collection there at the museum there was a firefinder that didn't quite... Oh, yes, sure. And so this was one that I knew I had run across a while before, and it's kind of an oddball one. It's a Bosworth versus the Osborne that the Forest Service usually used. And the map doesn't quite fit with the Forest Service because there's no green around there, so I really had no clue exactly what it was or where it came from, and Ron kind of filled me in on that. And so ironically, probably a week after that, I got the Facebook message saying there's going to be this discussion, so went back out and pulled this thing out of there. Interestingly, too, when getting this out, I found two other boxes with firefinders in those, and it's Union Peak and Saddle Mountain for the other two. So those are the three firefinders that are all out there in the museum. This one, as I mentioned, was kind of the weird Bosworth design, and I've never seen a base like this on any of them. You know, normally they're on the post right in the middle of the lookout, and this guy is the portable one that is not at all portable, just based on the weight of that thing. Do try to pick it up. Fortunately, it's in two pieces, or it wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have been able to carry the thing in. But like I say, there's two more of those out at the museum, and kind of neat that, or interesting that it just happened to be that I was talking to Ron at the right time.
Well, I opened up another can of worms there. Anyway, these fires that Jerry was talking about, and the one on Gold Creek, Chamberlain Meadows and all that. Anyway, the one up Gold Creek, see, I was at Seeley Lake at the time. There were actually 3 different fires up there. The BFPA fire, Forest Service, and the reservation fire. It got to be kind of a mess. we had our fire camp, BFPA had theirs, and the Indians had whatever, and it got toward the end of the fire, and anyway, the rangers sent me up there just to check and see what was going on. Sure as heck, I get up there, and here's an Indian crew sitting up there, smoke coming up and fires, and I don't need to say anymore, but we had to take care of it. Yeah. And then back to the one fire that I did go on with the BFPA. I just gotten off active duty out of the Army, and I was working here at the mill that one summer of '58. Another guy and I were swamping lumber out in the yard there for Lefty, and I look up, and there in the head of Deer Creek, here comes a big smoke. I told this other guy, I said, well, in a few minutes Lefty's going to be here, and he's going to gather us up. Well, yeah, he did. He ended up at the BFPA office and got in Joe Bouchard's 10.5 truck, stake truck, and he hauled us up to the fire. And so that was one BFPA fire. I was the one who worked for the company. Short period of time. And, talking about, and this is where I need to be careful because of the politics. I don't mean anything negative, but I was a dispatcher out at Bonita from '62 until we shut down in late '60s. Then I went back dispatching in the early '70s, and it was about that time that, the green trucks and the yellow trucks and this and that, they're passing one another on the road going to a fire. We got to do something about that. Chuck Wright. Yeah, Chuck Wright was there. And he and I had quite a few discussions about fires and, the road might be the boundary. This side is state, the other side is Forest Service. Well, we've got to do something about that. And I guess through the years it got it worked out pretty good to where you've got interagency, closest resource and all that. And that, I'm glad to see that, because it took a lot of political work and, people getting to know one another. So I guess that's kind of about it. You didn't even have to get a referee.
My name is Rick Swanson, and you were talking about the Elk Creek and Gold Creek fires. I was on both of those. One instance that I like to remember, I do like to remember, is we were walking the trail at nights along the fire line, and if you heard it, you know what I heard, and I heard snapping and cracking, and I thought, oh boy, something's coming down. Which way do I run? Well, I didn't. I just stood right there, and when it came down, it was probably about 15 to 20 feet away from me, and that scared me. And you were talking about the lagging and the Kurtz and the caps that you had. I loaded many of those railroad cars out here at the small log mill when they were going. Yeah.
My name is Glenn Smith. A lot of the locals around here that grew up with me call me the hooligan. I started my career out here at Bonner Mill in 1960. Before that, I worked the Saddle Mountain Fire down by Darby. So I'm used to Forest Service. I come into BFPA through the mill. They loaded us all up, says, got to go to Gold Creek. Okay, we go to Gold Creek, and we had no sandwiches. We had the tools and everything. They wanted us to work, but the meals at that time when they were getting set up were kind of iffy at best. So along towards about midnight, they managed to bring us up some sandwiches. A lot of them were processed meat. A lot of our crew wolfed them down. They thought that was the neatest thing they ever had. I elected, from my experience at Saddle Mountain, to stay with cheese. And about an hour later, half our crew was dove out into the bushes. They were puking and having a hell of a time. That processed meat just didn't set too good. Finally got a chance to go down, and I have to tie in with Kenny Pierce's recollection. We get to go down to have breakfast. Now, they've got the buses, old school buses, that look kind of like today's concession stands where they fold the side down and you get yourself something to eat. Okay, they had that set up. They were cooking pancakes. They had syrup, man. They were eating high on the hog. We're sitting out there enjoying our meal, and somebody says, hey, I believe the guy's name was Jake, get up there and get a can of those preserves. Had a gallon can of preserves. We'll put them on our pancakes. Jake run up there. He reached through the window of that cook bus, got his can of preserves, and there was 100 bazillion yellow jackets in that thing. Chase told Jake clear to Gold Creek, because we were parked right beside Gold Creek. Jake dove in, and them hornets was so gosh damn mad, they took it out on the rest of us, so we all had to take a bath in Gold Creek until them hornets cooled off. So that was my experience with forest fires. I hope I never have to go out on another one.
I'm Justin Iverson from Potomac. I wasn't born until the BFPA was long cold. But when our fire department was started in Potomac, some of the initial funding came from the trustees that were left managing the assets of the BFPA, including the construction of our first fire department station. So the BFPA name is positioned proudly up on top of that building. And when I worked on it was Department of State Lands and then DNRC fire crew up at Clearwater, all of our hand tools were painted blue and yellow. And I remember folks talking about the BFPA handles on the tools were maybe painted red and green. It helped identify which agency owned which tools. So now our fire department paints our tools red and green in honor of the BFPA tools. So I'm curious to hear from anybody who actually worked with any of those tools if they were painted that color, if that was just a story that got thrown.
They had an auction at the BFPA, I think it was 72 or late 73. There was about 200 and some people there, and if you had $10, it was supposed to be bids, but it went for $10 for a shovel, Pulaski, and maybe a pickaxe or a piece of iron and what have you, and that was pretty well attended. They were red and green. I think I left some up at the lake and they disappeared. They were good tools. They were made very durable.
So my name is Corey Calnan. I'm the current fire management officer for DNRC out of the Clearwater unit on the upper end of the Blackfoot. And it's just kind of neat to be here today and watch how much things have changed in fire protection, how much the BFPA is woven through everything we still do. Property assessments for the state. Fire protection is still the model that we do. The way we fight fire, the way we handle things, the fire trails that are on every ridge line in the Blackfoot are still there today that we do use on occasion. So a couple things we did have the firefinder from the Montour Hill lookout. We donated that last year to the Brand Bar Museum in Ovando, so you can see that firefinder there. And they actually have a pretty cool exhibit of fire history in the Blackfoot watershed. So if you ever make it up the Blackfoot, swing by there. The other thing that's still in existence is the old Hunters Point lookout. The building still exists. It's on the Clearwater unit compound. It's our oil house and has been an oil house for eons. So if you swing in the Clearwater unit, we have the old Hunters Point building that was moved off Hunters Point. So.
My name's Ryan Hall, born and raised up in the Blackfoot, Potomac. Just wanted to thank everyone for putting this together and doing this. My grandpa, years ago, Bob Hall, Robert Hall, Worked there, and I believe I had one uncle that worked for the BFPA. Sitting there doing math on my calculator, and I think he lied about his age because I don't think he was 18 by the time you guys were shutting down. But anyway, just wanted to thank everybody for putting this on. This is awesome. These are stories I've heard all my life, so to come here and experience it's pretty neat.
And Craig Thomas, I started work for Anaconda Forest Products in July 26, 1971. as a floor sweeper and a glue stick operator for a lamination department. I think Lamley was running that at the time. So I didn't work with the BFPA. However, there were some carryovers, because I was sent on several fires. And when everybody's talking about fire pay, well, I was on a forester's salary, and that's just the way it was. It's a fire, and you're on salary, and you go fight the fire. I have in my book, a chapter on fire, and that has a write-up by Fred Gunsler on the Gold Creek fire when he was burned over. Now, that might be interesting if anybody was interested in reading that. Last year, in 17, I spent 63 days on fires. Last year, I spent 19 days on fires. And I can assure you it's a lot different from what it was happening when I first started.
Yeah.
And for all the youngsters here, never go in the corporate bathroom with Mary Ann.
Yeah. I'm Dennis Sane. I worked in the mill starting in 1960, and the 1961 fire was quite an experience. They shut the mill down, and Mutt Tagg had that cab over flatbed truck the company had with kind of a stock rack. They put 2x12s across that there and loaded about 30 of us on that truck, and we went to the Gold Creek fire. I mean, that was, you didn't have a choice, you went. Art Feller, who was working in the mill at that time, he had just got married, and he was supposed to go on his honeymoon that weekend, but he spent the next week honeymooning on the fire.
Robert Dunlop. Andy, could you tell us what the protocol would have been in the early days of the BFPA? Let's say a fire is called in. Did they have such a thing as a hotshot crew or a quick reaction, or they just called the mill and said, send everybody up? Or how did it work?
Well, it was a tremendous resource, the mill, and contractors and company loggers and what have you. It was the muscle to be able to handle the bigger fires. The BFPA was really a initial attack or a strike force type of thing. They wanted to get to the fire as quickly as they could, hit it as hard as they could to keep it small, because if you could prevent that fire from growing, that was the way you dealt with it. And it was a kind of a mindset. But the backup was basically the resources. In the early days, like, for example, Don McKenzie and Headwaters Camp by Seeley Lake, he had at his disposal around 300 loggers, so you had the manpower and what have you. And the beauty of the BFPA was that you were able to mobilize and point that. And I can tell a story. I just want to make sure everybody gets their story out about how the attitude of going out and getting after a fire. It was in that organization. In state forestry, I went to work for them in 1970, and if you went out on fire and such, you didn't get paid for it in cash at that point. It changed with the Department of Natural Resources. Gary Moon had a policy that if you went out on a fire, you still had to do your basic job, whether it was in cooperative forest management, state land management, and what have you. So if you were on a fire 4 hours, you got 1 hour of comp time, regular professional time that you had. So that actually promoted an attitude on the part of anybody that went on a fire, was you didn't sit around on the fire. It came out of your hide, basically, so you had a mentality of, okay, you better get it done because you want to spend the weekend with your wife, get the fire out, because if the fire got big, it took away from your time. And most of the jobs that State Forestry had was the job needed to get done on a professional basis. And so, when it became such that people, were a little less aggressive, or it was a possible incentive to not get a fire down as quickly as you could, and you mentioned the tribal part of it there, or was mentioned, and sometimes you can sit on a fire and not do things, and human nature being what it is, if you don't get, if you get paid for, not being aggressive. But that was Gary Moon's policy at that time, and most of the foresters that were there in the 50s and 60s and early 70s, that was the way business was done. So.
My name is Anna Sane, and I'm going to talk about private industry versus the government. I am so sick and tired of the government and the Forest Service bowing to the whims of other people instead of trying to put a fire out. Yes, Ron Wakamoto, fire is a natural occurring element, but so is flooding. Okay? I personally called in when I was coming down Evero doing the loop to get on the interstate, a big snag that evidently was hit by lightning burning. And when I called it in, they say, oh, is there by any houses or anything? And I says, no, but you never know what the Evero winds will do. That became the Black Cat Fire. The Forest Service bows to everybody, but they don't want to necessarily put out a fire until it threatens people. And your insurance rates know what that means. It's just silly that the Forest Service won't put out fires because things have changed from a natural occurring fire to where people live out there and people die and all of these other associated problems. Now, I should give this mic back to my husband because he can tell you about the South people that fight Forest Service fires and protecting Garnet Ghost Town and a certain one-horned moose.
My name is Robert Starr, and I had a question, a couple of them. One, the board up here, we used to call those alidate boards. Was that a manufacturer of a different board, or were they all supposedly alidate boards and of different manufacturing? Okay, I just wondered, because when I was on a lookout tower, they called them all alidate boards. Okay, and how many here might remember the old signs from the U.S. Forest Service? I know this is a little bit probably before BFPA. I don't know when they started. The big sign that says axe, shovel, and bucket required to enter the National Forest. And at that time, I believe, if you were out in the forest, you could be put to work on a fire. Now, I know that when I grew up, I was a little younger. I shouldn't have been on the fire, but I knew there was a fire at Lolo Creek, up Lolo Creek area. And I just drove up there, climbed out, walked over to the truck and asked them if I could work. And they said, yep, here's a shovel, work up this side. And I turned in my time, and a few years later, or not few years, a few weeks later, I got a check from the Forest Service. But you could actually just go out there and go to work. Today you have to have all these little cards and credentials and this and that, and it's like you're going to die here if you don't have all this information. And it's almost like people are afraid to go to work on a fire, even if they are able-bodied. Another thing, I live over across the river here. Here a few years ago, there was a fire about 2 blocks from my house. And that season, we had 11 deliberately set fires on the Deer Creek Road. I went over there at 2 o'clock in the morning. I heard the Pillsville Fire Station light up with sirens. And I woke up to that, had the windows open. I could smell smoke. So I just grabbed my axe or my shovel and I hopped in the truck. Where is it at? Go find it and started working on it. Missoula Rural came up. East Missoula came up. I wasn't a legal firefighter by their accounts. So they had me handcuffed and were going to send me to jail. So I decided, well, first thing they made me a little mad is they took my shovel and threw it in the middle of the road. I said, you don't do that. I says, our fire trucks will run over that and ruin a tire. I said, I'm with East Missoula as far as a board member. They just, no, this is the way it's going to be. Until the news media showed up, they took the handcuffs off, they hopped in their car, the deputies did, and they left. So, you know, there's lots of help out here. Even at our old age can do a lot. But I agree with Anna, the one she was talking about on the fire was Black Cat Fire. I worked at the paper mill at the time, and we watched that one tree smolder for 3 days before the wind came up. And a couple guys that had beer the night before could have put it out that afternoon. I have one other question for anybody that might know. I'm looking for pictures from the BFPA on any of their possible fire trucks they used back in the day. I have old fire trucks, and I'm starting to build up a, you guys will know them, the Dodge Power Wagon, and I would like to find a picture of an old BFPA fire truck and see if I can't make my Dodge Power Wagon into a BFPA truck. So if you find something, a picture of it or something, please get it to me so I can just look at it. I won't take it away from you. I just want to look at it. And that's about it.
Well, this has been great. Anybody have a second thought? You want to bring something else up?
I don't want Mary Ann to downplay her importance to Anaconda and Champion. When I started working for Anaconda Company, I think Ernie Corrick was the chief forester or lead forester, whatever he was at that time. And so if we had a problem out in the woods, we'd call for Ernie Corrick. And if Ernie wasn't around, well, the second person we'd go to was Mary Ann, because whatever the problem was, she knew enough about what was going on that she could solve the problem. So she was a very invaluable, very valuable person in that office. It wasn't just a secretary. So we appreciate that, Mary Ann.
Okay, Kim. Oh, just a second.
I've got one other thing. It's not the BFPA, but when I was in the service and I went through jump school, and one of the head guys that was training us was just asking, well, where are you from? And I told him Missoula, Montana. And he said, well, do you know anything about the smoke jumpers? And I said, well, I know one there, and that's Fred Brower. And he said, that's one of the greatest guys I ever knew. So I just thought I'd pass that on as just a little human interest.
Yeah. I've got one quick story that I think you might be interested in. It kind of demonstrates the way fires were fought with BFPA personnel. After Ralph Hansen went to work for the state after the BFPA was shut down there. He was the dispatcher and fire warden there in the BFPA building. I was a forester working cooperative forest management, and I made the mistake of coming in, and one September day, I had an appointment and stopped off there. Ralph was looking for people to go to a fire. Okay, well, it was out by Warm Springs Creek, the Kaminko mine. So the station had a fire employee there with the slip-on tanker and what have you, and so I jumped in with him, and we headed toward the fire. What happened was we got a fire call right at Drummond saying, well, we can't get any personnel on the fire to assist immediately, but you're the fire boss, you go ahead and take care of the fire. Well, that fire turned out to be a 100-acre fire above the Kaminko mine. It was on a steep slope, September, what have you. And by the time I got there, they had the prison fire crew. And I had worked on several fires with the prison fire crew, a 20-man crew, usually 3 wardens and what have you. And so it got to be late in the day. We went ahead, basically lined 2 sides of the fire and had a scratch line on the top of it. And we had 2 engines there on the fire in the evening. And it was too cold because it was a late season fire, which normally died down and what have you, and it was too cold because we were dispatched without anything else but what was in the pickup. So because we had the prison fire crew, we had to get the prison fire crew back to the prison. So that night I spent on the 3rd floor of the old prison in the cells that they normally reserved for the clergy. There's a Catholic priest that stays there and what have you. And so I had the dubious distinction of coming home to my wife about 36 hours later, having spent, to tell her that I'd spent the night in the old prison at Deer Lodge. So I just wanted to tell you that was that, and Ralph Hansen dispatched us for that little episode. But one thing about fighting fires that, is the best time to fight fires has always been at night. You could do the work of 2 men at night. The fire, you generally settle down. You got lower humidity. The art form, and it was practiced by the BFPA. I mean, once you got on the fire, you didn't look for a place to sleep at night, basically. You went ahead and did the job that needed to be done, and it was good to get home after a fire, but we didn't, it was one of those things that was just the way you did things, so. Sure.
The big boss can work the night shift.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a different time, different place, different circumstance, but wildfire, you need to be aggressive on it. I think we probably better end it here because there's a lot of cookies, a lot of coffee, and those pasties sound real good. So, yeah, take care.
I'll do mine really quick. And it's basically on the BFPA legacy that lives on. And so Justin and Corey and Ryan, thank you for coming, because I had no idea about that, about how you've kind of kept the BFPA's colors, etc. I think that's a great story. Did I say your names right? Hi, Ryan. So I don't have anything I never had anything to do with BFPA, but sometime in the 70s, all the records of the BFPA went to the archives at the Mansfield, and so I spent some time looking through those, and I just wanted to touch briefly on what happened after the BFPA was no longer a forest protective thing. And I look around the crowd, especially with Ron, and Ron never missed a meeting from 1982 to 2002. Is that probably fairly close, Ron? So he was sat at the meetings with George Neff was the president. All through those years, they met once a year, usually in May, at the Village Red Lion or wherever. And in a lot of, basically it sounds like what they did was find the way to spend their money down because they had a lot of excess money. And so I was just going to run over briefly some of the things that they gave that money left over to. There was actually a twofold responsibility for the board, and there was 5 or 6 people on the board, including my dad. He represented Montana Power, the Montana Power Company, on the board, and so he joined in 1980. And like any good son, I have no idea what he did. Until I went through the minutes, there's my dad's name. But he and Ernie Korek, George Neff became great friends during that time. So, in 1973, the BFPA donated or sold all its remaining buildings and protection equipment, mainly to the state of Montana. Relieved of direct fire prevention and protection responsibilities, the BFPA's principal functions changed to reviewing the state forester's fire protection performance, to fire prevention and protection education, and the productive stewardship of the association's funds. So I just want to touch on that last one, the productive stewardship, if I can find it in my notes. Well, for one thing, they started out giving three $300 scholarships to forestry students at the Votech, and that expanded throughout the 70s and 80s to the forestry school at and to SKC, right? The Salish Kootenai College. And so that became a matter of thousands of dollars a year in forestry, in scholarships to forestry students. At the university, it started out as forestry majors, essentially. But at one point, and Gary Moon was, I think, kind of helping or running the scholarship program for BFPA. And at one time, they expanded that to 5 incoming freshmen. So it was an incentive scholarship to join the forestry school, as I understand it. Now, you catch me if I'm wrong here, Ron. Go ahead.
I can't think of the guy's name, the BFPA guy that they used. But it was set up to be a freshman scholarship.
Okay, let's try
that.
It
was set up to be a freshman scholarship.
They gave those freshman scholarships in the name of a particular person.
Oh.
But they still also did those other ones you're talking about. They did in addition.
Gotcha. Okay, and I didn't write down, if it was in the minutes, I didn't write it down. So there's a lot of things I didn't write down.
Old head can't think of it either.
So on the board, incidentally, George Neff was the president of the BFPA for 50 years, from 1952, I guess, till it officially finally closed in 2002. Marshall Moy was the secretary for, I think, most of those years, if not all. Ernie Korek, Ed Schultz, and Bernice Lowe was the note taker, as I understand. So those, and then of course Ralph Hansen was involved a lot of the time. So among the larger scholarships, or not scholarships, but other gifts they gave, in 1980, $4,000 to the Forestry experiment for the experimental sawmill out at the fort. That was a donation. I don't have these in very good order. They supported and helped establish the state tree farm program. Oh heck. As the years went on, it seemed like the donations became bigger. I think they were probably spending the money down. In 1989, there was a $20,000 donation to the Montana Wood Products Association, and in 1990, $25,000 to the National Forest Service Museum, which was in its fledgling years there and is now developing and still developing out on West Broadway where the lookout's at, etc. I asked Lisa Tate, who's the executive director there, and she found that gift in their newsletter from February 1990, I guess. And she said it said it was the $25,000 was received for this intent. When the museum is built, it will include quality displays on the important role private associations have played as forestry evolved in America, which to me means that the BFPA will be part of that museum. And we're hoping that'll come sooner than later. A couple of other things that BFPA helped fund, the Walter Hook mural that was along the lunchroom at Bonner School for all our growing up years, or all my growing up years. They made, I think, 2,500 copies of those and sold them for $20 a piece, so they're all over, obviously smaller ones. We've got a couple in our house, I know, the Walter Hook. And then they helped develop the John Mullen Park, roadside park across from Town Pump over there. Mainly, I think they gave $2,700 for the sculpture of Meriwether Lewis and Seaman in that park down there, and that was to Jim Rogers from Ovando there. In summary, I'm going to read you from the minutes of their last meeting, dated May 22nd, 2000. President Neff announced that this would be the final meeting of BFPA. At a board meeting on April 12, 2000, the directors unanimously agreed that the time had come to dissolve the association, to liquidate the investment portfolio, and distribute final grants. He noted that since 1972, when relieved of direct fire prevention and protection responsibilities, the association has dispersed $527,000 in contribution grants, $110,000 for pensions. They took good care of their officers, and $54,000 for operating expenses. In addition to the proposed grants of about $127,000 for this year, that would bring the total amount to over $800,000. Gary Moon said that George Neff deserves a standing ovation for presiding over such an accomplishment. Everyone wholeheartedly agreed and applauded. For President Neff responded that all members did this together. It's a record to be proud of. And I wasn't going to read this part, but I will now. The next thing in the minutes said, Bill Nelson presented to each director a certificate of appreciation from the Greeno Potomac Fire Department. He said the Jaws of Life tool had already been used twice this year. So, the legacy lives on. Yes.
Jim, I thought I would also just mention that there is a scholarship at the university in Ernie Corrick's name. You know, I worked at Ernie for many years.
At the forestry school, a scholarship at the university for Ernie.
Anybody who wants to, they contribute to that. I've done it several times, so
okay.
Keep that.
Something it can be attributed to. Jim, do you want this mic?
No, I would like to ask if there's anybody in the room that recalls being in the background of the Timberjack film production. One hand. Yeah, I figured there'd be about 20.
Shirley was. No, Shirley, you skipped school that day, right? Shirley Kaplan. Okay, I'm finished. Is there? It's pasty time as far as I know. If unless there's something else that we need to, we're kind of running right towards 4 o'clock. Thank you. That was better than I'd hoped.